What does it mean to tell a story in professional wrestling? Who makes up the stories and who brings them to life? And is storytelling relevant in today's business? Find out today on the Dr. Wrestling Podcast. Welcome to this edition of the Dr. Wrestling Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about telling a story. What it means to actually tell a good story, what it takes to achieve that, all the people that are involved in the process, the actors who must play their parts, and the different mechanisms that time has proven make for good stories in professional wrestling and sometimes even amazing ones. Professional wrestling makes a good backdrop for telling stories, but the mechanisms used in pro wrestling are not really that different than anything else used by Hollywood in movies or television shows. But there are some facets of pro wrestling that I think actually make it a little bit more unique and in some ways more challenging for the performers, but at the same time more rewarding for us as fans. Some fans even are moved to the point of true emotion, even emotion that follows them outside the bubble of the wrestling event. And those are very often the most memorable stories that lead to that kind of bubble. So let's take a closer look at that bubble. Whenever a fan chooses to enter that space and suspend disbelief for the sake of the entertainment value. Whenever anyone sits down to most forms of entertainment, whether it's movies, television shows, stage performances, or even quote-unquote reality television series, they voluntarily enter a state of disbelief. They suspend their disbelief and choose not to be so critical of things like continuity and potential logic issues. They overlook those things for the value of the entertainment that they're submitting themselves to. So it takes a certain mindset to enjoy most entertainment on that level. Pro wrestling really doesn't require anything more of the audience than that same level of disbelief, that same mechanism. But it does offer some things that other forms of entertainment may not be able to. And in my mind, realism is one of those big factors, because not only are those performers standing there in front of you, actually delivering their lines and performing what it is they set out to show you, but they're putting their well-being on the line. They're working together to simulate violence, to create these moves that are meant to awe and inspire you. And they're doing it all live. They're doing it in front of an audience. Very often they're doing it live broadcast all the way around the world, and they're doing it for the live audience in the arena. Very few people in entertainment ever have that kind of performance required of them. Stage performers certainly do, but all the different facets of what a professional wrestler has to bring to the table to have that level of performance that you see on your television screens each week, that's something pretty special. And to be able to nurture that feeling of disbelief, they have to be pretty convincing about it. They have to find ways to help the fans understand not only the story that they're trying to tell, but make you believe that they're really playing out those parts. Now, this kind of disbelief leads fans to be immersed in the show for hours at a time. And because of the nature of professional wrestling, they try to take fans along for that ride and make it as interesting and much of a variety as they can. But telling a good story is, in my opinion, the most realistic way that they can help you stay in that state and truly enjoy the performance as it's intended. Now, that state of disbelief doesn't really end for a lot of fans until the show ends, until they leave the arena, until they change the station. And that's really the only time they leave that bubble. A lot of people know the value of that kind of escape. And really, it's no different than a lot of other forms of entertainment in that. The escape that we all look forward to, leave our problems behind for a little while and enjoy the entertainment put on by another party. So the performers that you root for, you root against, are real people. They're not just actors in professional wrestling. They're not just reciting a few lines and then there's a cut. These folks are out there doing this real time, making all these moves, these actions, these words, these lines, these stories tell out in front of you. And yes, they're bound to make some mistakes, and certainly they do. But when they do their job well, whenever they tell a realistic story in an engaging way, fans are happily inside that bubble and enjoy that time. It's a really good place to be in those situations. And quite frankly, it makes it seem a little more realistic and makes you want to believe in it a little more than you might be if you're watching certain television shows. I mean, it's a little easier to follow a story in professional wrestling and root for your favorite instead of wondering, is Jack Bauer going to find a way to save the president yet again? Or which one of the male models is the Bachelorette going to choose to, quote-unquote, spend the rest of her life with? Pro wrestling offers a much more diverse and immersive experience than most other forms of entertainment, and that's what we're going to dive deeper into. So what does it take to tell a good story? What are the elements of a good story in professional wrestling? Well, just like most other forms of entertainment, traditional story structure of 3 acts, the setup, the confrontation, and the resolution, those hold true in professional wrestling as a rule and have proven over time to result in some very good stories. So the nature of professional wrestling certainly does lend itself to using that structure, but there are some things about wrestling that make them alter the use of that structure just a little bit. For example, professional wrestling is an ongoing story. It is a living, breathing thing that moves. It is not a finite period like a movie or like a television show. You don't always have something that ends in 2 hours or something that ends in a season. It's an organic, ongoing, living thing. And for that reason, stories typically are not told, more significant stories are not told across a matter of a few minutes or even a few hours. Very often they're told across weeks, months, and even occasionally years of time. And a very prominent aspect of what happens in television shows to keep viewers coming back week after week, a cliffhanger, is also employed in professional wrestling because viewership week after week not only helps you understand and get to know the characters better, but fosters a following, fosters viewership for the company, and obviously that leads to everyone's financial success as well. Some of those stories that have been told actually have spanned years, and sometimes it's just good fortune or serendipity that leads to some of the better stories that have played out on a long-term scale. An example of that would be if a star leaves a promotion and then returns a few years later. It has a chance to re-engage a former foe in that story once again. A very specific example of that is when Ricky the Dragon Steamboat returned to the Mid-Atlantic area in 1989 to take on Ric Flair and challenge him for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Steamboat had left the Mid-Atlantic area in the mid-'80s and gone to the World Wrestling Federation, where he had a great run and took part in what was arguably the greatest match in WrestleMania history, his Intercontinental Championship match, where he took on the champion Randy Savage. They put on an absolute clinic that people still marvel at to this day at WrestleMania 3, and Steamboat walked out with the championship. So the shine on Steamboat was still very, very strong whenever he left the World Wrestling Federation and returned to the Mid-Atlantic area, then WCW, in 1989. Steamboat took on old rival Ric Flair, and the clash of the two styles, the two mentalities and approaches of their characters told an absolutely amazing story. Flair being the rich, bragging, over-the-top champion who was amazing at what he did, knew it, and told everybody how good he was. Steamboat being the humble everyman who was just as talented as Flair, but wanted to see Flair usurped as far as his championship and to put him in his place due to his arrogance. They told some amazing stories across their trilogy of great matches in 1989, which I hope to do a podcast about because they were truly exceptional storytelling. But when it was finished, they had reestablished both Flair and Steamboat as top-tier talents and cemented their legacy in professional wrestling just across the span of a few months. That kind of epic storytelling can have a dramatic impact on a performer's career and can help make professional wrestling fans for life. So let's talk about the players, the different people who are involved in telling this kind of story. To have a really good story, you have to have a reason to care about the characters. You have to be able to identify with them. Professional wrestling typically does, come back down ultimately to a good guy versus a bad guy. But in this modern day and age, things are not so cut and dried. They're more nuanced, and sometimes you can have someone who sort of straddles that line. Along the traditional good guy lines, the sympathetic character very often might be perceived as an underdog, someone who is taking on multiple adversaries, someone who is fighting corruption, fighting to do the right thing, trying to earn their way in the work that they're doing in the ring. And a good example of that in today's wrestling is Sami Zayn. He's an incredibly capable wrestler. In reality, can have a great match with just about anyone you put him in the ring with, but he's taken on, strong technical wrestlers. He's taken on bullies. He's taken on monsters. He's been abandoned by his friends, been stabbed in the back, taken advantage of. But in the end, Sami always finds a way to stay strong and come back and prove that he is worthy to be considered among the best in the business, and always tells an amazing story within his matches. Another great example is Bayley. Very diverse and impressive in the ring, very sympathetic to so many fans, particularly young fans, because she is very optimistic, and some might argue somewhat naive, but she gives people the benefit of the doubt and encourages people at every turn. She only really loses her cool whenever someone wrongs her strongly, and she's proven herself to be worthy of fighting at the top tier of women's wrestling, which nowadays is saying a lot. An example, sort of from the management aspect of things, is Daniel Bryan. He is in a leadership role on the SmackDown program and is a fan favorite, but still faces a number of uphill battles against dominant heels and manipulative personalities on a regular basis. He also played the underdog very much in his wrestling days prior to his retirement, and the fans really identify with and resonate with him on a regular basis. The simple mention of the word yes during a broadcast very often results in Daniel Bryan chants and fans pantomiming his double point to the sky, chanting yes. Another great example is the monster Abyss. He is absolutely a monster in the business. He's a very big guy. He's super strong. He's sadistic at times. He's capable, but he has a heart. And though he can destroy people and has on a regular basis, he often will sacrifice himself out of loyalty and is often manipulated by people in power. So he is used as a weapon, sometimes against his will or without his knowledge. Looking historically, an underdog that rose to great success and fame was Sting. Beloved by fans everywhere throughout his entire career, he was left to fight off monsters left and right. Very strong technical wrestlers, of course, but also guys like literally the Giant, Hulk Hogan, Vader. He took on all comers in WCW, not always fighting for the title, but usually fighting for what was right, for what he believed was fair and just. He took on corruption and the power hungry with Ric Flair, with Lex Luger, the NWO taking over WCW in the mid-90s, and then in the WWE took on, during his brief stint there, Triple H and Seth Rollins. So he always established himself on the side of the angels, so to speak, to quote Sherlock. And I think he was always considered the underdog in more matches than not. And I think he personified the integrity of an underdog really well. While we're talking about underdogs, we've got to talk about the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. Dusty was the ultimate everyman. He never had the Adonis physique, the bodybuilder look that so many other people have had, especially in the last 20 years. But Dusty's charisma led him to amass an amazing following of the fans. He would take on performers from all around the world. He took on monsters, including Andre the Giant. He took on foreigners as a defender of America, all kinds of evildoers. He took on corruption within the system, whether it was evil promoters or the power-hungry Ric Flair. He could represent the everyman in so many ways, and that made him an underdog that just about anyone could root for. Another excellent example of an underdog from the ECW days was Tommy Dreamer. Tommy was himself an amazing fan of the business, came in and was dedicated to learn it and perform it, to step up to that level, and his love of the business showed through every time he stepped in the ring. He eventually went on to become a member of management in ECW and has continued as a member of leadership even to this day, I believe even in WWE for a while. And the fans' identification with him, the challenges that he faced and overcame during his times in the ring, made him an underdog that the fans would continually root for. Now, everywhere you've got an underdog, you've got someone who's trying to take advantage of them, to counteract them. And those would be a couple of different categorizations of characters, one of which would be the manipulator. The kind of person who's going to try to convert circumstances to their own gain, take advantage of other people's misfortune, and hang on to what they have at all costs. A good example of that in this day and age is The Miz. He's arrogant. Mike Mizanin is very convincing as a conceited star who is convinced of his own superiority. He will tell anyone who listens and plenty of people who don't want to. And coming out every week with his wife, just tries to brag about anything and everything he can at every turn. Eli Drake in Impact Wrestling, very similar character to The Miz. Both extremely capable wrestlers, able to tell whatever kind of story they need to in the ring, but normally that story is one of cowardice and manipulation. Bray Wyatt, talk about a manipulator. He uses the head game. He is very much, in my eyes, a second coming of Jake Roberts, because the psychology of his matches, his interviews, the stories that he tells with his words in addition to with his actions in the ring really can mess with his opponent's minds, and he can use that to outthink them. But he's so good at what he does, he gets cheered for it. That's something we'll come back to a little bit later on, but the kind of respect that he gets is largely because of his mental approach to the game. Charlotte Flair, establishing a new standard for women's wrestling. She has all of the qualities that her father had, Ric Flair. She is as manipulative, is as aggressive, is as grandiose as Rick ever thought about being. She is every bit as capable as a technical wrestler. She can put over other wrestlers very, very well. But her ability to anger the crowd while trying to control circumstances and help ensure that she stays on top in the women's division makes her a great manipulator. Looking historically, we got to see legends like the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. He clearly was motivated by power, motivated by opportunism. His willingness to use his money to influence decisions, to control other wrestlers, to eliminate obstacles from his path toward success, showed exactly how manipulative he could be. And along the way, he even literally, and almost successfully, bought the World Wrestling Federation title thanks to Andre the Giant. So his expression of everybody's got a price for the $1 Million Man was proven true time and time again, and it drove fans crazy every single time. The Nature Boy Ric Flair, as a glory hound, he talked a really big game, but he also backed it up. He could go out there in front of any crowd, control them, make them see his opponent as a credible threat, someone that could beat him and take his title on a given night, no matter who it was, no matter how young and green they might be. And he really launched the careers of such huge names as Sting, Lex Luger, played a big part in the long-term success and legacy of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and of Terry Funk. So you got to look at what Flair brought to the ring, but also realize that he was always trying to control the situations. And anytime you see somebody doing that and they don't get their way, they have their plan spoiled, well, there's a certain satisfaction in watching them get what's coming to them. Jake the Snake Roberts, we mentioned him a moment ago. He was the absolute master of the head games, of messing with people's mind. He would manipulate his foes before he ever even got into the ring. But when he did get in there, he could deliver every time. Jake was a wonderful example of someone who was so good, so connected with the crowd, and so well identified in his role that putting a title on Jake was not really necessary. He's someone who could stay on the forefront, be a formidable foe for just about anyone, and you didn't need a title to make him relevant. Paul Heyman, representative of Brock Lesnar now, but the mastermind behind ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, and the man who was so relevant in so many aspects of professional wrestling for the past 25 years. He's had such a big impact. He is known by everyone in the business as a prolific liar, a phenomenal talker, and he has cheated his way out of lots and lots of bad situations, to his detriment, occasionally into even worse ones. But he has established himself as someone who can position someone he represents into good matches, into good situations, and help get them out of bad situations. So as a representative for Brock Lesnar, he's obviously done a great job, similar for CM Punk and for Curtis Axel, but in the end, Paul Heyman has used his personality, his nature, his voice to manipulate so many different situations in professional wrestling that it's hard to find a more poignant example. We're going to take a break and be right back. I want to take a moment and say thank you to one of our sponsors, Silverworks.net. Silverworks produces handmade, one-of-a-kind, unique jewelry, silver, copper, and brass, every piece handmade by the artist. There's something there for everybody on your list, so give them a look. Silverworks.net. That's SILVERWERKS.net. Silverworks. Uncommon goods.
Do just like every one of these people would do. Pucker up and kiss my ass.
Oh, I think he's going to lose his lunch. Here comes oh my gosh! God! Oh my gosh!
Stone Cold!
What is this?
Stone Cold's wearing Mr. McMahon's bare ass out with that leather belt.
And we're back talking about telling a story in professional wrestling and the people that make it happen, the kinds of characters that you need to tell a good story. We've already talked about the underdog and the manipulator. Now we're going to talk about the tyrant. The tyrant is a character type that became very, very prevalent in the mid-1990s, especially in the World Wrestling Federation. And there is no better example of a tyrant, someone who holds down the little people and plays favorites at the expense of the good guys, than Vince McMahon himself, the promoter and chairman of the World Wrestling Federation, World Wrestling Entertainment, and the epitome of the quote-unquote evil promoter. He would routinely interfere with matches, would intercede to try to change the outcome, change the focus of the match, and the promotion itself to remain on whom he wished to be promoted rather than who the fans wanted. He deliberately contradicted the fans, and through the use of that kind of control, it bolstered the Stone Cold Steve Austin character to unprecedented heights in popularity and legend in professional wrestling. Vince, as a tyrant, made Stone Cold as a hero, despite being an anti-hero, popular on levels that had never been seen in the business before. So Vince McMahon is the shining example of exactly what it takes to control the audience and guide them in the way that they need through opposition as a tyrant. Another excellent example is Vince's daughter Stephanie and her husband Triple H. Less so now than in more recent years. She still shows favor to heels and admonishes baby faces, indicates their weakness and emphasizes it on television, makes unfair matches while running Monday Night Raw, and seems to keep things shook up a little bit, taking steps to change the product, not necessarily in the way that the fans would like to see. Triple H also steps in and influences the programming sometimes, and whenever he often plays that role, it's to the fans' disliking. Another great example from the late 1990s is Eric Bischoff. Ken doll, so to speak. He was an announcer for many years. Fans had come to know and trust him as a voice of WCW. And whenever the NWO invasion occurred and Bischoff came forward as the leadership of the NWO, not only was it shocking to fans, but it completely changed his character. It allowed him to go from being a talking head and an innocent bystander announcer to being a slimy executive, an underhanding foe, and a cowardly underminer of everyone on the good guy side of WCW during the NWO's prime years in the 1990s. Another archetype that works out really well in professional wrestling is the jerk. The kind of wrestler you just can't wait to see get what's coming to them. The kind of person who rubs you the wrong way, who brags just a little too much or shows off their skills a little too much, and you just want to see them get their mouth shut. An example of on the current wrestling scene of a good jerk is the Miracle Mike Bennett. Very unlikable, as a character, very conceited. Makes it very clear that he doesn't have any interest in what anybody thinks of him, and loyalty means basically nothing to the guy, but extremely talented in the ring. On top of the WWE roster right now, the phenomenal AJ Styles. A lot of fans say he's the best wrestler in the world right now, and quite frankly, I'd have to agree with them. And I think AJ would too. He knows he's the best. His character believes in his superiority. He knows he's the best wrestler on the entire roster and wants to prove it every night when he goes out there. Yes, he flaunts it to the fans, but he delivers top-tier matches every time he steps in that ring. On the Raw side of things, Kevin Owens. He's a prize fighter. He knows he's great, and he's out to prove it every night when he goes out there. He might duck and dodge opponents occasionally, despite his gimmick arguing otherwise. But he is extremely good at irritating the fans, convincing them of his belief of his superiority, and still telling a story to put over whoever he's wrestling. And those kind of characteristics that both of those guys bring to the table, putting over whoever they're in the ring with while still putting on entertaining matches and making the possibility of defeat believable, those are characteristics that make for a great heel champion, and they both are doing a wonderful job on their respective brands. Historical examples of jerks: ravishing Rick Rude. Few were perceived as arrogant as Rude. His confidence of his superiority, of his masculinity, of his physique, rubbed everyone the wrong way, except for a lot of the ladies. And there's not a good guy on the roster who didn't end up taking Rude on to try to shut him up. The reality is he put on great matches, made huge contributions to several stars, the Ultimate Warrior being a big part of that, a big beneficiary of Rude's work. And he's someone who played that role of an arrogant jerk to the hilt. Another contemporary of his and fellow Minnesotan, if I remember correctly, Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig. He argued that he was perfect in everything that he did, though his win-loss record didn't really reflect that. What I think he was very best at is bringing out the best in a lot of his opponents and making them look like $1 million, because Kurt could wrestle, Kurt could put on a good show and tell a good story. His mic work escalated to a new level when he went to the World Wrestling Federation, and he could really convince you that he believed he was perfect. Yeah, he lost matches from time to time, but he didn't worry about those things. He knew there was another reason for it. But when it came down to it, he executed everything perfectly. Another character type that we need to consider is largely for the entertainment value, not so much for telling long-term stories, but short-term, and providing some levity to the fans, is the buffoon, the fool, someone that you can't help but feel sorry for, even though they might be a bad guy. Somebody you know is, dang it, they're trying their best. They just can't seem to get their way. Right now, Chris Jericho, Y2J, despite being a big success in World Wrestling Entertainment, is somewhat playing that role because he routinely walks into traps set by good guys. Just like walking into that cage that Mick Foley convinced him to step into, where he'll be suspended above the ring for Kevin Owens' match at the Royal Rumble. That kind of situation Jericho pulls off beautifully. He routinely walks into situations that we all know he's too smart to fall for, but it makes for a very compelling story and makes it more believable that somebody that good in the ring might still be beatable, if for no other reason than because they don't see these things coming. Historically, another great example of that is Bobby the Brain Heenan. Bobby put wrestlers over like no one before him and no one since. And sometimes he had to do that physically. He had to literally trip and fall and stumble to achieve whatever it was he was asked to do. He cheated on a regular basis and was as selfish as he could be within his character, but you still had to feel sorry for him because so many situations he would stumble, fall, sometimes physically do pratfalls to get over with the crowd, to make them believe in the good guy, to make them have sympathy for him or side with the good guy, even when he wasn't doing such a great job winning them over himself. So Bobby sacrificed a lot of himself and his humility to get his job done. On the other side of that, there's one other character that a lot of good stories need, and a lot of guys do a great job of playing this role, and that's the victim. Someone caught in the crossfire, someone the target of powerful foes, someone stronger, smarter, whatever it is. A good example of that in today's wrestling is someone who didn't even really exist on the wrestling radar 6 months ago, and that's James Ellsworth. Basically, he's a jobber who ended up across the ring from a monster WWE was building at the time, Braun Strowman. He was nearly broken in half in his match, but he got just a few seconds on the mic, and people remembered him. He had a unique look. Not necessarily in a positive way, but unique nonetheless. And he made the most of a very small and unexpected opportunity. And to this day, he is still someone who gets their name on the screen a heck of a lot and gets some ring time on SmackDown. So you got to give it to him. He took advantage of that. But he is not there to overpower anybody. He's not there to outsmart anybody. He is there to be the victim, and that's pretty much the role he always plays. Historically, Eugene was a simple-minded character in the World Wrestling Federation, was a heck of a wrestler, but he was manipulated a lot by other characters, and eventually that led to him being a heel, which gave justification for fans to dislike him, but at the core, his motivations was the fact that he was being manipulated and he felt like he wasn't being treated fairly. So as a victim, he executed the character very well. Another example is Rick Steiner of the Steiner brothers. Rick was odd. He was immature when he first arrived and acted very impulsively, but he was so strong and explosive. Fans definitely got behind him, and when he finally got up the nerve to rebel against his captors, the bullies who always seemed to be holding him back and preventing him from excelling, like the Varsity Club in early WCW years. He really generated a lot of sympathy for the fans. And once that victim status, that underdog status that he would help promote was resolved, he found it a little harder to stay relevant with fans. So being the victim, being the subject of a lot of manipulation has its advantages, but you got to have the strength behind it to persist after you've overcome those obstacles. So let's talk about what it really takes to put on not just the story from a performance standpoint, but the other elements of the story that have to be there. One thing that is very easily lost in a lot of professional wrestling nowadays is the stakes. Why are these guys fighting so hard? Why are these performers taking each other on? What is the object of it? That's not to say that wrestling fans, particularly purists and long-term fans, don't really enjoy a technical spectacle. We really do. But for it to be a good story, it can't just be these two wrestlers went out there and wanted to put on a great match. You need something more than that. You need some stakes for them to go after, something to achieve with it beyond quality of performance. The most popular, most common stakes that lead to great stories is titles, championships. Two wrestlers taking each other on to achieve the notoriety and greatness that comes with a title really is the quintessential story arc in professional wrestling, but it's very heavily leaned upon, and it is assumed by many promoters, and I think quite incorrectly, that just because a title is on the line means it's going to be a compelling story. There needs to be more to it than that. So a title alone is not enough to be the motivation for a good story. Success in many different forms can also be a big point of contention for a wrestler, the crux for a match, the motivation for them to take each other on. Sometimes it's just about television time. Eyeballs on the screen means dollars in their pockets. Sometimes there's literally money or prizes on the line. Maybe it's a trophy or a tournament to establish someone as a higher level star. Of course, sometimes it's titles, but very often it's simply for notoriety. It's simply to get screen time, to get visibility, to get promotion by the organization. Sometimes the storyline goes to the dramatic side a little bit more, and it's about love. It's about the obtaining the affection or the hand of the character you're longing for. And sometimes a very similar story might play out when you're simply trying to impress someone. You're trying to demonstrate respect or admiration for someone. The most frequently used catalyst for a match, stakes, so to speak, would be to get revenge. Anytime a character wrongs another performer, very frequently it leads to some kind of match where their hatred for each other is expressed in extreme forms. This was the catalyst for the original cage match, where a character wants so badly to destroy his opponent that his opponent has routinely managed to sneak away or bail from the ring and avoid the wrath. Well, putting him in a cage prevents that from happening. Sometimes in a very similar storyline, you end up with a chance to literally eliminate one of your foes. And we're not talking about killing anybody, but we're talking about eliminating them from the promotion or from a group, from a faction. Loser leaves town matches were extremely prominent during the territorial days because it was a reason for a wrestler to leave a promotion. But in the end, the character who won was able to expel their opponent from the promotion or from a feud or from a faction. And that can be very rewarding and a very rich story for the fans to see. Occasionally, we have a story where a character is on a streak of some kind. Either they're undefeated or they've gone so long winning at a certain event across time that defeating them would be an achievement. It would be a real step up for whoever achieves it. So look at the Undertaker streak that's going on at WrestleMania. Brock Lesnar ended that streak to many people's dismay, including mine. I believe that was a huge mistake. But it made for a very engaging story that year after year fans came back to see play out. And they always wondered, was the next foe for The Undertaker going to be the one to end the streak? There's no title at stake there. There's no other stakes involved, no other context for it other than, is someone going to beat The Undertaker? And that alone makes people go to WrestleMania on an annual basis. Now, the next big catalyst to a great story, in my opinion, is the payoff. Getting the stage set to establish why two people are taking each other on is one thing. Having the right people in there to actually tell that story in the ring and go through the process of bringing the fans along with them, telling the arc of that story so that you're invested in the outcome is a huge part of it. But the actual payoff and the creativity that can come from that really is what provides that resolution to the fans. Sometimes that's a title. Sometimes it's achieving a dream. Someone who's been promoted is always wanting to achieve what they're striving for, and then when they finally achieve it, it's seen as a huge success and a change to their life. Sometimes it's just being on that stage, being at that level in the business is in and of itself a huge achievement. Sometimes the payoff itself is not just someone winning, but the person losing, taking their revenge, taking their frustration out on the good guy. A good example of that is Sami Zayn capturing the NXT Championship from Adrian Neville, only to have it a few minutes after celebration to have all of the spectacle of that destroyed by his former friend Kevin Owens. And the retribution aspect of what happened there was Sami went from being a sympathetic good guy who finally achieved a lifelong dream to now all of that history was set aside for him to focus on getting revenge on the man who stole his moment, stole his thunder, and that backlash of what Owens did led to an extremely engaging storyline with Sami. And the fight between those two has continued for multiple years, and any time the two of them ever face off on television, fans remember that. Fans remember that level of engagement that those two guys had. And that payoff in a given match might very well be the end of a storyline, the end of a feud, or simply set the stage for the next phase of that story. There's lots of times that one big match might just lead to another one. There might be a series of matches planned. It could be a best-of-7 series, which is a very interesting take and gimmick on matches in a feud. But if the story is meant to end a feud, it can particularly be satisfying. And normally that happens at a large event. We're going to take a break and be right back.
And now Flair has turned the corner. He twists the leg. Inside. Wait a minute, inside cradle. Can he hold him? Yes, he can! Ricky the Dragon Steamboat has won the world title!
It was the ultimate counter. Who would have believed it out of nowhere? A small package, no luck. The champion goes down.
And we're back on the Dr. Wrestling Podcast talking about telling a story in pro wrestling. Well, who comes up with these stories? What's the reason for it? I mean, why do they go to the trouble? And are stories really relevant in professional wrestling nowadays? Because the business has changed a lot. Let's take a look at that in more detail. Most wrestling promotions, their stories are generated by one of a number of different people, different roles. Normally it's the promoter themselves, different members of management who are chosen for their capabilities, or in the case of a large company like World Wrestling Entertainment, they have a team of writers, sometimes dozens of people, who come up with these different stories because they have such big rosters and such a lot of television time to fill, such a lot of shows to put on and promote, that they need multiple people in the creative realm to just come up with ideas and execute those alongside the talent. These stories serve a lot of different purposes, but their goal in the end is to generate interest and eyeballs on the product. They need to not just generate but sustain interest in the performers, because the performers are the face of the company. And when it comes down to it, if people aren't watching, if people aren't buying the merchandise, if they're not helping generate advertising revenue, if they're not subscribing to services, in the end, the promotion cannot sustain. So as much as we want to think all of this is about good storytelling, good narrative, good compelling drama, and the amazing athleticism that these performers put on a nightly basis, it is called professional wrestling for a reason. It's about money. It's about these people making a living, about the fame that it generates and the notoriety that leads to more people watching, and therefore more revenue for the company. World Wrestling Entertainment, for example, is a publicly held company. So in the end, they've got stockholders to answer to, but they're interested in growing this business. They're interested in expanding it. And if you look at the success they have financially, and then compare that to the size of their roster and how many people they employ, not just as in-ring performers, but company workers, actual employees of the company who perform all kinds of different jobs, they've got a lot on the line. They got a lot at stake every time they come out there and put on a show. And the success that they have achieved on the level at which they've achieved it is certainly something very impressive. Not many companies have done so well with so little in their origin. The promotions are obviously very concerned about revenue. They get that from broadcast rights, from pay-per-view revenues, from their video subscription services, from DVD sales, from live event admissions. Merchandise sales plays a big part in it. Advertising, but also their character likenesses. Modern promotions, especially World Wrestling Entertainment, own the rights to a lot of their characters. So if those characters are used outside of the context of their programming, then they have to be licensed to do so. So the company generates revenue from that as well. But within that goal, obviously there's a lot of flexibility about how they go about telling stories and generating fan interest. What they're interested in first and foremost is not just interest, but loyalty. They want to build loyalty long term. They want fans like me who have been a fan of the business for a long time. They want to build more fans like that because it helps future-proof their business. And there's a lot of different types of acts that they can put on that will draw attention to them. They have celebrities come in from time to time, and that gets eyeballs on the product, but it's meant to simply draw people who would not have otherwise watched. They put on spectacles with all kinds of different acts, like very large competitors, Andre the Giant, The Big Show, Yokozuna, guys with really impressive physiques, girls with impressive physiques, of course. They have people do crazy things in the ring with dangerous stunts, dangerous moves on a regular basis. World Wrestling Entertainment is trying to curtail that kind of thing and make it a safer workplace, and I certainly applaud that. Sometimes there's strange, crazy gimmicks that they come up with, or that different wrestlers come up with to try to promote themselves. But the connections that a performer generates with the crowd is what keeps fans truly coming back. If you enjoy that kind of entertainment, you're going to watch it from time to time. You're going to watch it on a regular basis. But if you've got a connection, you're invested in a character, you're going to be drawn to it. You're going to gravitate toward it, and you're going to want to stay abreast of what's happening. That's the kind of fan they really want. Adonises in the ring come and go. Giants rise and fall. Sexy performers blossom, fade across time. The business has shown all of this to be true, but the heart and athleticism, the charisma that some people bring to what they do and the way they combine it rings true with people. And it keeps them coming back and keeps them on the edge of their seat week after week, keeps them invested in what happens to these characters. That is the lifeblood of professional wrestling. Not the casual fan, not someone who tunes in occasionally. People who watch it every week. Those are the people that will be around for the long term. In the United States, the landscape of professional wrestling has undergone a lot of change in the past several decades. Cable television revolutionized the business, just like television originally did. Major territories, the territorial system that existed until the mid-1980s came to a close, and Vince McMahon created a near monopoly across the next 3 decades in the business, eliminating most of his competitors one by one until there were so few foes left that he literally bought out WCW, took advantage of ECW's financial situation, and was left effectively the only large promotion in the business, and ran with it. But what keeps fueling the engines that run the promotions are the fans that keep coming back to support their favorites, to boo those that they hate, and there's a lot of draw to feel like you're a part of the professional wrestling landscape. It's a community in and of itself. It's a brotherhood. Just like fans of a sports team feel connected, feel like they are associated with one another. And all you got to do is see somebody wearing the hat for your favorite team, and you automatically have a connection with them. You can just start talking with them about it. The same thing's true for professional wrestling. You see someone wearing a T-shirt for one of the performers that you respect. You see someone mimic an action of one of the wrestlers that you like, and there's a kinship there on some level. And it can be a community experience that can bridge lots and lots of other differences. The subscriptions, the T-shirts, the box office, the buy rates, and all those things that ultimately drive revenue for a company really come down to the heart of what makes the business viable, and that's fans. Fans want to believe in the story for a little while. They want to cheer their favorites, boo the bad guys. They want to see that kind of magic, that kind of storytelling happen. They want to be immersed in that. They want to get sucked in. And it's no different than any other form of entertainment in that respect. The difference is, you're going to get to see them next week. You're going to get to see more of the story play out. You're going to get to root for your favorite, and you can stick with them and have that loyalty rewarded over time. And that kind of belief, that kind of following, can make you a fan for life. So what does a story mean to a fan? What does the story itself actually bring to the table for the fan? You've seen a lot of very athletic, a lot of physically impressive performers. They're only going to accomplish so much without being able to connect with the fans. At one point in time, an example of this is WCW had hired Bill Kazmaier, the world's strongest man at the time, came into WCW, came to the ring carrying a giant inflated globe, holding it over his shoulder. Probably one of the strongest men to ever set foot in a professional wrestling ring. But unfortunately, despite being, as I understand it, a very nice guy, Bill just didn't connect with the crowd. They put him in a tag team with Rick Steiner and tried to help generate some following for him with that, but it just didn't resonate. It just didn't work. And as unfortunate as that is, and I'm sure as good of a guy as Bill was, it didn't ultimately come down to his in-ring ability. It came down to his inability to relate to the crowd, to connect with them. If a fan doesn't feel like they understand a character, if they understand what motivates them in some way, they probably won't be very motivated by that character's winning or losing. Their adversity that they might face, their success against that adversity, or their failure won't mean very much to the fan. And having a variety of characters is always important. It helps you relate to a bigger group of people. We can relate to to characters based on size, physique, race, hair color, voice, personality, whatever it might be. But if that's all you've got in connection with them, that interest is probably not going to sustain. It's not going to draw you in very much. They've got to relate to you on a deeper level than that. Those are ways to get you in the door, but they got to keep you coming back. Identification with the character is what really makes fans engage, makes them want to wear a character's t-shirt, to imitate their words, their catchphrases, to mimic their movements and behaviors, point or make a stance like a wrestler, and to feel like they have a stake in the character's success. Not that they want to see him win one match, but that they want to see him succeed in the long term across the years. And when you want to see that, you want to find out what happens, that keeps you coming back wanting to watch. This kind of connection could be established with a casual fan, but making someone into that long-term fan requires a deeper connection than those surface, characteristics we talked about before. And even across, long periods of dormancy, of, maybe not being involved in wrestling at all, can bring a fan back through not just nostalgia, but the reestablishment of connection to the business. Goldberg's return to WWE last year was great for ratings. It brought a lot of eyeballs back onto the product, and a lot of people who never really watched him that much in WWE but knew him from WCW came back and watched those episodes, came back and watched the Survivor Series and his match against Brock Lesnar. And those same people are largely going to stay engaged as they build toward the Royal Rumble and ultimately to WrestleMania. So it's a very telling aspect of being a professional wrestling fan, that nostalgia and that form of connection that comes with it can draw you back in, and draw back in significant volume of people after such a long time without a given character being on the scene. Nostalgia as a concept certainly has its place in wrestling. It can bring back an old favorite and draw you back into the business, but you got to get hooked based on something else, because chances are those performers are not going to stay around too long. And quite frankly, nostalgia is a well that the promotion can only go to so many times, as they saw with Hulk Hogan. Shoving a prototype, pun intended, down your throat like John Cena or Roman Reigns doesn't usually work out, because if they don't connect with the fans, they will be left behind. Fans will not identify with them and won't promote them. And in the end, if you keep trying to shove them down their throats, they're going to reject them, as you've seen with Roman Reigns. Cena, he loves the business and gives his best at every turn, but they've had to acknowledge that fans don't connect with him the way that they would like him to. Roman Reigns, again, I'm sure he tries very hard, but half the time he seems like he's in over his head and just seems to be turned around trying to follow directions. So you can't always take someone who looks like a good prototype, looks like they would fit the mold, so to speak, and expect them to connect with the crowd and lead a new generation of your business. Real, natural, organic following of fans happens when you've got a performer that connects with the audience on something deeper of a level. And once those fans start to care, if they really care, a part of them will always care. They might not have time in their life to dedicate to watching wrestling, but they'll always care. They'll always want to know what's going on, and they'll always root for that person anytime they're able to watch. We're going to take our last break. We'll be right back. I want to take a moment and send a shout out to our friends Keith and Kevin Davis and thank them for the use of their song Bounce, which you hear at the beginning and ending of each podcast. Thanks, guys. Okay, we're back. We're talking about telling a good story in professional wrestling, and we've covered lots of different topics about what makes a good story, who tells that story, and how they go about it. Telling a good story one that fans can really relate to, get behind, and get invested in, is usually, in my opinion, what separates good matches from truly great ones. A match where none of the participants make a mistake is certainly an achievement. Hitting your moves, hitting your spots, always trying to be in the right place at the right time, relate what you need to the camera, to the live audience, not fumbling your words on the microphone. All those things are very important parts of what they do. But succeeding in that isn't success in telling a good story, necessarily. Great execution, layered with and elevated by a good story that emphasizes each of the characters' strengths and weaknesses, that's really what makes an event relatable to the fans. And it can elevate a good, technically sound match to make it memorable and more meaningful for the fans. Maybe even leave a lasting memory behind. Now, the term match of the year gets tossed around lightly nowadays, in my opinion. But when you see a match that is truly well executed and helps build both characters, not just one of them, can really relate what those characters' motivations are and help the fans choose for themselves what they want to see happen and then tell a good story around that narrative, you as a fan will recognize that good story, will recognize the value in that story. And if they do it really well, you might even feel it. That's what keeps you coming back. Some examples of great stories that have been told in the past, 3 decades of wrestling. We talked about it earlier. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Ric Flair in 1989, their trilogy. Steamboat is a babyface who at one point, literally, or his son, rode in on a white horse against the arrogant, materialistic champion in Ric Flair. An amazing story. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just needs to relate something to the audience. Sting, as an up-and-coming, young stud in WCW, challenging the established Ric Flair in 1988. Their match at the First Clash of the Champions made Sting a star, and they continued to battle until 2001 and actually fought on the very last Monday Nitro. The respect that those two have for each other was absolutely amazing, but they told good stories in the ring, and they didn't even need to necessarily come in with a great deep storyline to tell an engaging story in the ring. WrestleMania 13, Steve Austin came into his match with Bret the Hitman Hart. Austin was a very charismatic and energetic character that had a huge following, but he was a bad guy, and he made no bones about it, offered no apologies. Hart was a disgruntled long-term star who was growing weary, and his situation as a babyface was somewhat precarious. The promotion decided to try to take these two amazing athletes, amazing characters and stars, and perform a double switch so that Bret went over the line and hurt Austin in a way that a babyface shouldn't. Austin, simply through his tenacity and unwillingness to submit to Hart's sharpshooter finisher, had him pass out in a pool of his own blood. That turned Austin into a babyface. An anti-hero for sure, but a huge babyface. And it was the launch of arguably the strongest babyface run in modern wrestling. And we'll talk about what happened in the late 1980s in the World Wrestling Federation with Randy Savage, the Macho Man, and Hulk Hogan, the Mega Powers. Both guys had unbelievable presence in the ring, on the microphone. They had following and popularity that was unrivaled at the time. And for the two of them, Savage as a heel and Hogan as a face, to join forces and take on the corruption of the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, Andre the Giant, and whoever else might have aligned with them during that time. The forming of the Mega Powers was a very compelling story. And with Miss Elizabeth in tow, and ultimately becoming the the object which they fought over, even if only from Savage's perspective. It made for extremely engaging television week after week, got a lot of pay-per-view buys, and when Savage's jealousy led to the explosion of the Mega Powers as it was promoted, the main event of WrestleMania 5 was a huge seller for World Wrestling Federation at the time, and it just showed Savage at his very best. He was a paranoid maniac, determined to hang on to everything that was his, both his wife, in real life, not in the story, and his championship. And it provided an amazing platform for Hogan to do, admittedly, the one thing he did extremely well, which was to step forward and overcome that kind of adversity and that kind of megalomaniacal behavior. Well, this will wrap up this edition of the Dr. Wrestling Podcast, talking about storytelling in professional wrestling. Thanks for being a part of the show with us, and we'd appreciate your feedback. Please visit us over at drwrestling.com to find out more about the show, when the next episode's coming along, and provide us your thoughts and feedback on our shows and what you'd like to see in an upcoming episode. You can also subscribe to the Dr. Wrestling Podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, and on YouTube. Thanks again for listening to the Dr. Wrestling Podcast, and just remember, keep watching and keep believing. It doesn't have to be real, it just has to mean something. Good night, everybody.